In May 2023, a convenience store owner, Mr. A, was standing in front of his shop looking at his smartphone. Then an old man approaches him, then stabs him with a sharp knife. Mr. A pushes him off in desperate attempts to save his life. However, although Mr. A wants to run away from the man with the sharp weapon, he physically could not, as he has unfortunately been already stabbed in one of his thighs. So while Mr. A is retreating back slowly in pain while trying to stop the bleeding that was happening on his lower body, the old man grabs the knife again, stands up, and once again goes after Mr. A. So Mr. A kicks the armed man with his decent leg, making him fall, then takes the sharp weapon away from him. Mr. A did not conduct any further physical harm onto the criminal after he took the knife away from him, and the police eventually came and took the criminal away. However, on July 28, 2023, Mr. A received a shocking message from the South Korean prosecutor's office, which is the fact that he is to be investigated not as a victim, but as the offender who has conducted assault on the armed criminal. This is as under the South Korean law, what Mr. A has done in order to defend himself from literally being stabbed to death is not considered as self-defense. You may think that I'm joking, but I'm not. You have literally been already stabbed in your thighs, and the person with the weapon is coming after you to get you again. So you first push the armed person away, then when he came after you for the second time, you kick him to the ground and take the weapon away from him and do him no further harm. Now, if this is not considered as self-defending yourself in order to save your life, then I really do not know what is. But according to the South Korean judicial system and their interpretation of self-defense, this does not seem to be the case. When I first saw this news last week, I was extremely saddened for the convenience store owner Mr. A and could not help but think of the traumatic event in which Helen and I have also recently experienced. Now, as many of you guys already know at this point, although I have technically lived more years of my life in Japan compared to South Korea, Helen and I are still South Korean nationals, meaning that we do go back to Seoul a few times of the year. And while we were back in Seoul this April 2023, one of the most frustrating events of my life have occurred. On the right side of our house, we have a small outdoor space of sand where we have planted a few small trees and some flowers. Now, this small outdoor plant space of our house is very hard to access by outsiders, as you have to weave yourself through the narrow parking lot in order to get there. And please keep in mind that this part is not some public space, but a part of our property, as in both the parking space and the small outdoor plant space. And one day I was working on my computer, and outside the window I see a skinny man get into our property, weave his way through the tight parking lot space, and get himself to our plant space and start digging the sand with his hands. So I immediately get out of the house, approach the man, and ask him what on earth he thinks he's doing. His response was, to quote, "Oh, I did not know there was someone home. I was just trying to put something here." Now, this response absolutely enraged me. First, illegally getting into our property, and the response was that he was just trying to quote-unquote put something in our house. So I asked him what on earth he was trying to plant there. However, no matter how many times I asked him, he never specified the object and just kept saying some stuff. So my first instinctive guess was drugs. In South Korea, especially in Seoul, it has become a huge social issue these days of how the usage of recreational drugs has permeated largely throughout the society. And the way that many of the dealers in South Korea sell them are through methods such as first receiving the money from the buyers through online bank transfers, and once the payment has been confirmed, go out and plant these drug-filled bags in places such as inside the flower pot placed in front of other people's houses, or tape it next to a tree or a brick wall where not many people can see, etc. So a bunch of thoughts stormed through my mind at the time, as we really could not have these criminals around our property. I cannot be looking outside the window all day, and there is only so much a CCTV can do as well, as Helen and I are not always in South Korea throughout the year. And all of this was happening while this criminal was trying to walk away to the exit side of our property as fast as possible, to the point of almost running. So while I really wished to physically grab a hold of him, call the police, and find out exactly what he was trying to plant in our house, I simply could not. Let's say that I grab a hold of him and he physically retaliates. I believe more than likely for a guy of this kind, there is a very high possibility that he'll be carrying a Swiss knife of a kind as well. So as what happened to the convenience store owner Mr. A, let's say that the criminal who was trying to just quote-unquote plant something in their house starts swinging with the weapon and I have to push him away. And me being this 220 pounds person, while he was this 5'2", 95 pounds looking skinny addict, let's say that he lands the wrong way to the head when I push him off and goes unconscious or does not wake up or something. Now that I do not even want to think about. You saw what happened with Mr. A. The guy was literally stabbed and was under the threat of being attacked again, so had to do what he had to do in order to save his life. But even Mr. A is most likely to be prosecuted as the offender for his quote-unquote assault on the stabber. So what do I do as a person facing such a situation under such a jurisdiction? I had to quite literally let a criminal walk into our property, let him do whatever quote-unquote putting something in their activity that he wanted to do in our plant space until I stopped him, then just let him nonchalantly walk outside of our house with his own 2 feet.
Can't touch me.
As again, physically grabbing hold of him and waiting for the police to come is not an option in South Korea, with the nation's almost non-existent set of quote-unquote self-defense laws. Now, I believe you guys can already viscerally fathom why we want to so passionately create this video. First, with the rise in popularity of South Korean drama, music, and just the K-culture in general, I know so many people who come to South Korea for travel, or to study as an exchange student at one of the universities, or come to work in the country. I mean, if you walk outside the Gangnam area on a normal day, I have never seen this many people from foreign countries around the world in the streets, in what used to be considered as a rather homogeneous nation of South Korea. So for such of you guys, this video will be vital for you when you unfortunately face a situation when you're approached by a hostile individual in South Korea, or someone tries to break into your house as similar to our case, or your hotel room, or as in the case of what is happening exponentially more frequently in South Korea over the past few months, come across a random knife attack on a busy street. Because as hard as it is, if you scrutinize the legal precedents of South Korea, there has been some cases when certain acts were admitted by the South Korean court as self-defense. So we are going to introduce you to some of these cases in South Korea where self-defense was justified, as well as the ones that were not, and find a pattern from such precedents that will allow you to know just how much action you can take in order to defend yourself for your life when there is an attack towards you while you're in South Korea, without having to go to jail for quote-unquote assaulting the criminal who was just trying to end your life. And of course, even if you're not necessarily planning to visit South Korea, this video will still be educational in the sense of allowing you to understand the in-real-life worries held by the real ordinary people of South Korea behind all the flashy lifestyle depicted in the Netflix K-dramas and the K-pop idols. So without further ado, let's take a deep dive into the absolute absurdity that is South Korea's current set of self-defense laws and what we can do to defend ourselves under such a legal system. Now, let us first have a look into some representative precedents where self-defense was not justified, hence the victim faced jail time for quote-unquote over-retaliation. This is to educate you first on what not to do when faced with a dangerous or a life-threatening situation in South Korea. In March 2014, a burglar broke into the house of a family living in the city of Wonju, located in the Gangwon province of South Korea. The 20-year-old son of the household, who had returned home, got into a fight with the burglar in order to get him out of the house and hit the head of the burglar during the process. The burglar, who was hit in the head, went unconscious and was later diagnosed as brain dead. The 20-year-old son was sentenced to a year and 6 months in prison. Now, Case A may sound like an absolute mind-blower, especially for those of you who are currently residing in the United States. This is as we see news all the time, as in how a homeowner literally shoots the intruder who was about to break in or has broken into their house, oftentimes making the intruder quote-unquote unalive, but still not face any charges, with their act being classified as rightful self-defense under legal doctrines such as the Castle Doctrine that are currently applicable in 16 US states, as in the state of Illinois or North Carolina. However, such is absolutely not the case in South Korea. To elaborate, even when the criminal has literally walked inside of your house with an armed weapon in their hands, you still have to be extremely logical and deliberate in the extent of your physicality with the burglar or the murderer or whatever the criminal may be. To elaborate, the reason why the 20-year-old son in Case A was sentenced to 1 year 6 months in prison was, according to the exact words used by the South Korean prosecutors, excessive violence, meaning that the prosecutors believed that the 20-year-old did more than what he had to do in order to defend himself and his family from the burglar. The fact that the burglar got specifically hit in the head and went unconscious and later diagnosed as brain dead had a big influence on why the South Korean court also agreed with the side of the prosecutors as well and sentenced the 20-year-old to prison. So what does Case A tell us about what we should specifically do when a burglar or any other type of criminal enters into your house or in your hotel room when you're in South Korea? You first have to do whatever means necessary to avoid conducting any act in which the South Korean prosecutors may view as quote-unquote excessive violence, while you're conducting self-defense to save your life. So as unreasonable as this sounds, as in you are literally in a situation where your very life is threatened, and your endocrine system is probably producing the most amount of adrenaline it has in your entire life, you still have to be very logical in regards to which body part of the criminal you wish to target in the process of taking the weapon away from the criminal. As in smashing their head or pushing them forcefully is not a good idea, as if you hit their head in the wrong way, then there are obvious chances of the criminal facing a life-ending injury or going permanently unconscious. Pushing them away forcefully is also not recommended for similar reasons, as depending on where you are, the criminal may land on the floor in the wrong way, as in smashing their head hard on the concrete floor or smashing their head into the wall, once again increasing the chances of a fatal injury to the criminal. So one of the best things you can do in order to have your act of self-defending for your life to actually be admitted as self-defense by the South Korean court is to conduct acts such as punching the criminal in the stomach then running away, or if they have broken into your house, meaning that you can't really run away in the situation, take the weapon away from them after punching them in a non-head area such as the stomach, push them down on the floor, and hold them on the floor with your knees. And one of the most important things to keep in mind is that once the criminal has been overpowered, you absolutely must not conduct any further physical harm on the criminal, as the criminal has already technically been, well, overpowered. To substantiate, the reason why Mr. A, the convenience store owner whose case I introduced at the very beginning of the video, is likely to be prosecuted is because if you scrutinize the CCTV footage, the man with the knife has already fallen onto the floor after the first kick, meaning that in the eyes of the South Korean prosecutors, the criminal has already been overpowered. However, in order to take the sharp weapon away from the criminal, Mr. A kicks the criminal the second time to absolutely make sure that the criminal cannot retaliate when Mr. A tries to take the knife away from him. So without that second kick, there is a much higher possibility that Mr. A's acts of self-defense against the stabber may have been admitted as self-defense by the South Korean court. Now, we want to briefly introduce Case B to you guys in order to re-emphasize that self-restraint and not getting angry at the criminal is extremely important when defending for your life in South Korea. In April 2020, a man, Mr. Kim, was having some drinks with a friend at a park located in Incheon, South Korea. And I guess this quote-unquote friend was one of those toxic figures who disguises himself as a friend, but in the back of his mind has always wanted to harm you or want to bring you down. We all know that person. So this quote-unquote friend, on the excuse of being quote-unquote drunk and that he was angry from an argument, stabs Mr. Kim on the arm. Mr. Kim, also infuriated, knocks the sharp weapon away from him and continued to beat up his friend who just stabbed him. Mr. Kim's quote-unquote friend had to be hospitalized for 5 weeks. Now, I get Mr. Kim. If your quote-unquote friend has just tried to end your life and has already stabbed you, it is more than reasonable to be angry over the situation and feel inclined to do more than just knock the weapon away from him. But then again, Mr. Kim went to court where he appealed to the judge that his actions were in self-defense, only to have the appeal subsequently denied. To quote the exact words from the judge responsible for the case, to quote, "I agree partly as to why Mr. Kim would state that his acts were done in self-defense. However, Mr. Kim continued to assault the offender even when his weapon has been dropped, and the degree of the assault can be classified as over-retaliation. Hence, Mr. Kim was convicted guilty and faced jail time, although receiving probation as this was his first crime committed." We bring Case C to you guys to let you guys know that the logic of quote-unquote an eye for an eye from the Old Testament does not work in the South Korean judicial system. For example, in 2012, a criminal was attempting to enter the house of Mr. Lee in the city of Jeonju, South Korea. The criminal climbed the walls in order to get to Mr. Lee's house, which was located on the 3rd floor of the apartment, while holding a steel pipe. When the criminal showed his face in the window, Mr. Lee took the steel pipe away from the criminal and smashed the head of the criminal twice, leading the criminal to be hospitalized for 3 weeks. Mr. Lee was later sentenced to a year in prison for his quote-unquote assault on the criminal. To quote the exact words of the South Korean court, to quote, "Mr. Lee was still inside the building while the criminal was still outside of the building at the time, hanging outside of the window. So Mr. Lee could have found other ways to stop the criminal from entering the house, such as closing the window rather than stealing the pipe away from the criminal and hitting him." Yes, these are the exact words of the Honorable Judge of South Korea, working for the sake of justice and for the protection of the nation's people. Now, what can we learn from Case C? This precedent tells us that while you're defending yourself in South Korea, you cannot simply retaliate with the same weapon held by the attacker, as in, if your attacker has a steel pipe, this does not justify you defending yourself with a steel pipe. The same logic obviously applies to other weapons as well. So just because the attacker is chasing after you with, let's say, a bat, it doesn't justify you taking the bat away from the attacker and use this bat to overpower the criminal and believe that you'll be protected under the nation's self-defense laws. Now that we have covered the legal precedents where self-defense was not justified by the South Korean court, which allowed us to know what we should not do when facing a life-threatening situation while in South Korea, let us move on to the rare cases when the South Korean court admitted the acts of the defendant as rightful self-defense. In May 2019, two men, Mr. Park and Mr. Yu, got into a physical altercation in the city of Daejeon, South Korea. Mr. Park raised his hand in a motion that seemed like he was going to hit Mr. Yu, in which Mr. Yu retaliated by pushing away the arm of Mr. Park that was raised. Mr. Park, stating that Mr. Yu initiated physical contact first, began to assault Mr. Yu by grabbing hold of his hair. Mr. Yu, attempting to free himself, punched and pushed away Mr. Park. We can clearly see who's in the wrong here, and that's Mr. Park. First raising his hand in a threatening way as in the motion of about to hit Mr. Yu, then first grabbing hold of the hair of Mr. Yu. However, we all know how these Karen-type villains behave. It was Mr. Park, the hair puller, who first sued Mr. Yu, claiming that Mr. Yu has assaulted him. Now, I really like the judge who was responsible for this case. The Honorable Judge, Gu Chang-mo, did not find Mr. Yu guilty, stating that what Mr. Yu has done was in the act of self-defense. Judge Gu went on to further criticize the prevalent set of laws and precedents existing in South Korea, stating that South Koreans of today are just being forced to be beaten up when a fight breaks out, as all South Koreans know that whatever retaliation they commit during the fight is most likely not going to be admitted as self-defense. Judge Gu went on to further state that this is a, to quote, dimension which shows the backward legal culture of South Korea. However, conscientious judges, as in the case of Judge Gu, is an extreme rarity in South Korea. But returning back to the point, what can we learn from Case D when it comes to understanding the degree of self-defense in which we can conduct without having to worry about being prosecuted in South Korea? First, it is vital that in the process of self-defending, we do not seriously harm the offender. As in the case of Mr. Yu, he did not hurt Mr. Park to the extent in which Mr. Park had to be hospitalized. So if you're a physically strong individual or an individual familiar with martial arts, then you have to be extremely cautious about the degree of force that you insert when self-defending yourself from an attack. And meeting a favorable judge such as Judge Gu will also help you out as well if you are to go to court, but that is something that is out of our control. On November 2019, Mr. Cho and Mr. Shin were gambling inside the house of Mr. Cho. Mr. Shin, who was angry about the fact that he has lost money, began to threaten Mr. Cho with a sharp weapon. Mrs. Cho, the wife of Mr. Cho, who was also present at the time, held the hand of Mr. Shin and took the weapon away from his hands. Then Mr. Cho put Mr. Shin on the floor, held him on the floor by pushing his neck down with his knees, then called 911. It took 10 minutes for the police to arrive, and by the time they arrived, the attacker, Mr. Shin, has passed away from being unable to breathe. Now, by this point, you guys might think, poor Mr. and Mrs. Cho. The attacker has passed away, so under such a legal system, they're most likely going to face jail time. However, to many people's surprise, Mr. and Mrs. Cho did not face jail time, and their acts were admitted by the South Korean court as self-defense, despite the fact that the attacker died during the process of being restrained until the police arrived. So what are the specific elements of Case E that has allowed the South Korean court to view the situation as rightful self-defense? If you look closely into the situation, we can see that Mr. Cho did not commit any further acts that may be deemed by the prosecutors as quote-unquote over-retaliation or excessive violence, such as punching the attacker once he has already been overpowered and was lying on the floor. Mr. Cho just made sure to hold the attacker down until the police arrived. Now, in terms of the attacker becoming quote-unquote unalive during the holding down process, the court deemed it as something in which Mr. Cho had to do in order to keep himself and his wife safe until the police arrived, and that the death of the attacker was not something in which Mr. and Mrs. Cho have intended. If you've been watching the video carefully, you'll have noticed that Mr. Cho's actions were almost identical to the advice for self-defense in which we've provided during the explanation for Case A, which was to not hit the attacker in the head or push them away, but to remove the weapon from their hands and have them on the floor and hold them down with your knees and call the police. Again, we do acknowledge the fact that just having to consider all these technicalities when self-defending yourself from an attacker with a sharp weapon is just absurd, as anything can happen in an actual crime scene, and it's not as if you can be this quote-unquote thinking man who can calmly analyze the situation and have all the time in the world to plan out the next move. I mean, someone is running at you with a knife. But at the same time, if you do not have these considerations firmly in mind when self-defending yourself from a life-threatening situation while in South Korea, it is highly likely that you'll be prosecuted and face potential jail time, as seen from the unfortunate precedents of the victims of Case A, B, and C, and of course the convenience store owner, Mr. A. So please keep our advice in mind, especially if you're the type of person who may enjoy nightlife and like visiting areas such as Itaewon, or are living or visiting South Korea and have chosen to live or choose your Airbnb in the rather cheaper rent, higher crime rate area or a low security building in Seoul in order to save costs. Alright everyone, that's it for tonight. Thanks for watching today's episode of Age Analysis, and please subscribe to our channel, check out our book, and we will see you guys next time.